She asked for a glass of water. What she got was humiliation, cold, deliberate, and public. But what the flight attendant didn't know? The elderly black woman she dismissed wasn't flying alone. Sitting right behind her was her son, a billionaire. And in just minutes, this flight would go from silent prejudice to global reckoning. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. She didn't look like the kind of person who could shatter a system. Her steps were quiet, measured, barely audible beneath the hum of the boarding passengers. She wore a soft beige cardigan, pearl earrings that glinted subtly in the overhead lights, and a silk scarf knotted at her collarbone, dignity wrapped in elegance. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, and to the world, she was just another elderly black woman flying alone. She didn't demand attention. She didn't expect it either. And yet, what happened to her at 36,000 feet would ripple far beyond the clouds. Eleanor took seat 3A in first class on a flight from San Francisco to Chicago. The flight attendant barely acknowledged her, offering only a cursory glance, like checking a box. No smile, no warmth. Just a look that said, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply nodded politely and adjusted the handle of her small handbag on her lap. Moments later, the same attendant, tall, composed, white, glided down the aisle toward a younger woman dressed in designer sweats and oversized sunglasses. Champagne? Laughter. A touch on the shoulder. She moved like Eleanor wasn't even there. That was the first insult. The second came moments after Eleanor, quietly, kindly, asked for a glass of water. The attendant blinked, like she hadn't heard right. Then came the sigh, the roll of the eyes, and finally, the answer, crisp and cold. "We'll serve drinks after takeoff. Please wait." The tone sliced sharper than the words. Eleanor nodded again. "Of course, dear. I'm sorry for bothering you." She wasn't the type to make scenes. She'd spent a lifetime choosing silence over confrontation. Too many memories of being told her place. Too many moments when raising her voice only brought more trouble. But on this flight, trouble didn't wait for her to speak. The third insult wasn't just a word. It was the flick of a wrist. A half-empty plastic cup, placed with such careless force, it tipped, spilling water down Eleanor's blouse. Cold soaked through silk. She gasped, startled, clutching a napkin with trembling fingers to dab at the spreading stain. The attendant smirked. "Maybe next time, wait your turn," she muttered under her breath. That was when he stood up. Row 3B, right behind her. Quiet until now. The man was tall, dressed in a dark navy pullover, and had the kind of calm that makes people take a second look. His name was Carter Brooks, and while most passengers assumed he was just another business-class traveler, Carter was the founder of one of the most powerful tech firms in North America, a man with more silent power than the airline board itself. But in this moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a CEO. He was a son. And someone had just humiliated his mother. "Excuse me." His voice was soft, but sharp enough to cut through the entire cabin. Did you just knock a drink out of her hand? The attendant froze mid-step. Every passenger who had kept their head down until now turned. Slowly, uneasily. Silence unfurled across first class, like a fog creeping over water. I didn't mean to. It was an accident, she stammered. Carter took a step forward. An accident? Because she asked for water. Because she looks like someone who doesn't belong here. Whispers rippled down the rows like a current. Eleanor sat still, her hand clutching the wet napkin, eyes lowered, cheeks burning. She had never liked causing a fuss. But this wasn't her causing anything. It was being done to her, in public, with eyes watching and mouth silent. The attendant opened her mouth, closed it again, and took a step back. Sir, I didn't realize she's my mother, Carter said. And she shouldn't have to be anyone's mother for you to treat her with basic respect. A few passengers looked away. Some shifted in their seats, pretending to reread the safety card. But others, the quiet ones, the thoughtful ones, held their breath. Because they knew what they had just witnessed wasn't a mistake. It was something deeper, something older, and far too familiar. And yet, no one, not one person, had spoken up until power entered the room. The captain hadn't announced anything. The seatbelt sign was still on. But in the air, a different kind of turbulence had already begun. One that would never be measured by instruments or avoided by altitude. Carter didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. He took out his phone, typed a message to his operations team, and slid it back into his pocket. The flight attendant disappeared behind the curtain without another word. And the rest of the plane? It held its breath. What they didn't know, what she didn't know, was that the man in 3B was about to turn one moment of silent prejudice into a reckoning that would echo across corporate offices, national headlines, and the hearts of every quiet passenger who had once felt invisible in a place they paid to be. This wasn't just about a spilled drink. This wasn't just about an insult. This was the spark that would light a fire. And the fire was just getting started. Carter Brooks had spent most of his adult life being underestimated by strangers and overestimated by the media. A walking paradox in a tailored world, he had learned early on how to wield silence like a weapon. In business meetings, silence made men squirm. In boardrooms, it drew power. But in moments like this, when dignity was stolen in plain sight, it became something else entirely. A reminder. The silence after his words settled into the cabin like a low fog. No turbulence. No sudden announcements. Just tension. Visible, prickling, undeniable. Carter didn't move. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but there was a weight behind his stillness. Those who knew him would recognize it. The look he had when a deal was about to be dismantled, when a company was on the verge of collapse, and no one in the room yet realized it. To the other passengers, he was still a mystery. Some knew the name, others didn't. But they all felt the shift, the way the atmosphere thickened the moment Carter's voice had sliced through it. Eleanor, his mother, remained still in 3A. Not because she was indifferent, but because she had been through this before, many times, in quieter ways, in lonelier places, when her son wasn't behind her and no one came to her defense. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time the world would finally watch. The flight attendant, Amanda, hadn't returned from the galley. Whispers flickered down the aisle like candlelight, soft, flickering, barely spoken aloud. That's Carter Brooks. The Carter Brooks? You're kidding. Did you see what just happened? But Carter didn't care about the attention. He didn't care about the passengers or the headlines that would surely come later. Right now, he was focused on something much simpler, something sacred, his mother. He leaned toward Eleanor and gently offered a cloth napkin from his seat tray. She looked at him, her eyes still shimmering from the sting of humiliation, and gave the faintest nod. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was acknowledgement. She had raised him with the belief that your response to disrespect defined you more than the act itself. But there was a difference between staying silent and staying small. Carter wasn't small. A few rows behind them, a flight marshal, a plainclothes officer named Jim Rourke, watched the exchange closely. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't needed to. There had been no threats, no shouting, just a son protecting his mother. Still, his hand lingered near the clasp of his ID badge as he clicked his pen once, jotting something into a small notebook. Not because he saw danger, but because he knew power when it moved. Back in the cockpit, the captain had already been briefed. The call from corporate had been short but decisive. Carter Brooks was aboard, and a serious incident had occurred involving his mother. The directive was clear. Defer to him. Don't escalate. Don't downplay. Just follow the procedure and document everything. The captain wasn't new to this. He'd flown politicians, diplomats, and executives. But none of them, he suspected, carried the kind of influence Carter Brooks did. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet kind that rewrote policies. In the rear galley, Amanda stood alone. Her back was pressed against the cold aluminum wall, arms folded tightly over her chest. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Her jaw clenched, her breath shallow. She had known something felt off the moment he stood up. Not just because of what he said, but the way he said it. The kind of tone only people used when they were used to being listened to. And then she made the mistake of Googling his name. When she saw it, his company, his philanthropy, his influence, her stomach turned. This wasn't just a misstep. It was the kind of misstep that ended careers. Amanda didn't cry. Not yet. But the weight of it started to settle in her bones. Not just the mistake, but the reason behind it. The part she didn't want to admit. The way she'd looked at Eleanor and made a decision. One rooted not in policy, but in prejudice. Not spoken, not deliberate, but just as damaging. And now the quiet man in 3B had pulled back the curtain for everyone to see. In first class, Carter had returned to his seat. His posture was calm, but his fingers moved quickly on his phone. No press, no tweets, just action. Messages to his assistant, notes to legal. A quiet storm forming behind the glass screen. His mother hadn't spoken again, and he didn't push her to. She deserved her silence on her terms. Behind them, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down. Others avoided his gaze. One older man, clearly from the financial world, cleared his throat softly and said, "If there's anything we can do." Carter turned slightly, his eyes unreadable. "You could have done something already," he said, "but you didn't." The man said nothing more. It was never just about a drink, or a tone, or a single act. It was about what the act revealed, what too many people saw and chose to ignore. Carter had spent his life breaking through those invisible lines, the subtle gates people didn't admit they built. But his mother? She had walked through them long before he had a name to wield. She deserved better. Not just now, in this seat, but always. The clouds outside passed slowly across the window as the plane continued east. But inside the cabin, something else was shifting. Perception, power, perspective. And the passenger in 3B had just made sure no one would forget it. As the aircraft leveled into cruising altitude above the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber, casting long shadows across the polished tray tables and sleeping passengers. But no one in seat 3B was sleeping. Carter Brooks sat upright, hands folded over his lap, the blue glow from his phone screen reflecting against his jawline. He wasn't typing anymore. He wasn't even looking at the incoming stream of messages from his legal team, his assistant, or the silent army of executives already preparing contingency plans before the plane would even land. He was just thinking, measured, quiet, deliberate. Across the aisle, a young woman who hadn't said a word since boarding finally leaned ever so slightly toward the window and let her eyes settle on him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The shift had been felt by all. It wasn't just the confrontation. It was the awakening it had triggered. The moment everyone realized that silence wasn't just complicity. It was a decision. One that now lingered in the recycled cabin air, bitter and unforgiving. Flight attendant Amanda had not returned. She remained in the rear galley, suspended in a silence that felt louder than any reprimand. Her senior colleague, Daniel, a seasoned attendant with a reputation for diplomacy, had now taken over the first-class cabin. With a practiced calmness, he approached Eleanor in seat 3A, offering a fresh cup of warm water without a word. No apology, just a quiet act of reparation. Eleanor nodded once in acknowledgement. Her fingers, still slightly damp from the earlier humiliation, accepted the cup without shaking. Carter watched the interaction, his gaze unflinching. He knew what Daniel was doing, trying to patch a sinking ship. But dignity wasn't something you handed out after the fact. It was something you protected before the damage was done. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came through the intercom with routine updates: altitude, flight time, anticipated weather over Dublin. But even his tone had changed. It was more careful now, less automated, as if aware that every word over that speaker was now part of a story none of them could escape. Behind Carter, passengers stirred. Some pretended to return to their books or movie screens, but their eyes betrayed their distraction. No one wanted to admit what they had witnessed. A glass of water spilled on an elderly woman. A flight attendant's unspoken prejudice exposed. And a man who could have stayed silent but chose not to. And that choice, that single choice, had changed the entire landscape of the flight. At 36,000 feet, the air was thinner, and so was the patience for excuses. What had once been an ordinary first-class cabin was now a theater of reckoning. The kind that didn't involve shouting or lawsuits, at least not yet. Instead, it hovered like the hum of the engine, steady and impossible to ignore. Eleanor sipped quietly from the cup, but the hurt hadn't faded. Not completely. She had been raised in the South during an era when service came with a side of suspicion, when looks lingered too long, when doors didn't open and names were misspelled on purpose. She had survived it all with grace. But grace, she knew, should not be mistaken for tolerance. She turned toward her son slightly, offering a glance that asked nothing and said everything. Carter returned the look. He wasn't sorry for stepping in. He was only sorry it had to be him. That there were still people who needed convincing that women like his mother deserved kindness. no matter what row or what skin they came in. Daniel cleared his throat softly as he approached again, this time standing beside Carter. "Mr. Brooks," he said in a hushed, respectful voice, "I just want to assure you that the matter is being handled. The captain has filed an incident report and ground protocol has been activated. I've also personally made sure your mother has everything she needs." Carter didn't move. "It's not about what she needs now," he said quietly but firmly. "It's about what she never should have had to endure to begin with." Daniel nodded, chastened. "Understood. We're truly sorry." Carter turned his head, just enough for his words to reach, but not his eyes. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to her. Not with words, with policies." The flight attendant stepped back without a word. At the back of the plane, Amanda finally moved from her seat. Her uniform, once pristine, now felt like a costume she no longer deserved to wear. She pulled it straight out of habit, but her hands trembled. She didn't fear losing her job. She feared something worse, being seen for what she had let herself become. Someone who had been trained to care, but had chosen, instead, to judge. She remembered the way Eleanor had looked up at her, startled but not surprised. The way Carter had stood, not with rage, but with something far heavier. Disappointment. The kind that didn't yell. The kind that echoed. She stepped to the side galley mirror and stared at herself. She barely recognized the reflection. She saw a woman who had grown too comfortable with the wrong kind of power, the kind that draws lines in invisible ink and calls them policy. And for the first time in her career, she understood that uniforms don't make you professional. Your choices do. In the cockpit, the co-pilot handed the captain a printed directive from ground control. Upon arrival, debrief senior flight crew. Passenger Carter Brooks will be met by legal and executive teams. Discretion required. The captain signed it without hesitation. This wasn't just a PR crisis. It was a cultural fracture, and it had already gone airborne. Back in 3A, Eleanor pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The warmth from the cup in her hands had begun to fade, but something else inside her had not. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible, not because of the attention, but because of the choice her son made, not to protect her, but to recognize her, not as a victim, but as someone worth defending without needing to earn it. At altitude, something had shifted. And it wasn't just the plane. It was the awareness that when dignity is disturbed in silence, it can be restored in the quiet thunder of action. The wheels touched down with a soft screech, but the silence in the cabin was anything but gentle. The usual rustle of movement, the clinking of seat belts, the scraping of carry-ons shifting underfoot, the idle chatter of passengers preparing to disembark was conspicuously absent. Instead, first class sat in collective stillness, as if all on board knew they were descending into something more than just a runway. They were landing into consequence. Carter's hands remained clasped in his lap, his gaze steady, unwavering. Eleanor sat beside him, back straight, the shawl draped around her like armor. Her blouse had dried, but the memory of it soaked and clinging to her chest had not. It lingered not because of the discomfort, but because of the humiliation. Because a woman like her, despite all her years of earned dignity, had still been reduced to less than... A soft chime signaled the final descent procedures. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, measured but with a subtle shift in tone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dublin. For those in our forward cabin, please remain seated. Ground staff will be boarding to assist with a matter involving crew coordination. The phrase, crew coordination, hung heavy in the air. A euphemism everyone understood wasn't really about logistics. The passengers who had sat in silence earlier were wide awake now, their gazes fixed ahead, waiting. Amanda hadn't re-emerged from the galley. She knew what was coming. Her name had likely already been logged into incident reports, already entered into systems where red flags flashed next to crew IDs. She didn't check her phone. There would be no comfort there. No one would message her support. Not after what she did. Not with who she had done it to. Her career wasn't just in danger. It was dissolving. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Carter's phone vibrated once on the tray table. A brief glance at the screen confirmed what he already expected. A black sedan waited at the gate. 2 legal representatives had arrived an hour prior. A PR team was on standby, prepared to issue a statement, but only if Carter approved it. But what statement could capture what this had really been about? A soft knock at the cockpit door. Then the cabin door clicked and opened with a hiss. 2 figures boarded, a uniformed airline supervisor and a tall man in a dark suit with a badge from corporate affairs pinned to his chest. They spoke briefly to the captain, then began walking the aisle with deliberate calm. "Flight attendant Amanda Walsh," the supervisor said when they reached the galley. Amanda stood slowly. Her legs felt like concrete. She didn't argue, didn't ask questions. She simply removed her name tag, unclipped it from her lapel, and handed it over. The murmurs from the passengers were hushed, like ripples on still water. Some looked away, embarrassed to watch justice unfold when they themselves had been too silent. Others followed Amanda with their eyes until she disappeared past the curtain. Daniel, the senior attendant, took her place at the front of the cabin. "Mr. Brooks," he said in a low, reverent tone, "you and your mother are cleared to deplane through the forward bridge. A private escort will meet you there." Carter nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "Ready?" She gave a soft, steady nod. "Let's finish this." As they stood, several passengers lowered their gazes. One woman in 2D muttered, "I'm sorry," though her voice was barely more than a breath. Carter didn't respond. Eleanor didn't even glance at her. Sometimes apologies weren't owed to those who watched in silence. The pair stepped out of the aircraft into a corridor flanked by neutral-faced staff, all professional, all silent. At the end of the bridge stood 2 men. One, a legal representative in a trim suit, the other, a senior executive from the airline's Dublin headquarters. Their posture was practiced, their smiles tight. "Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Brooks," the executive began, voice subdued. "We deeply regret the incident on your flight. On behalf of the entire airline—" "Not here," Carter interrupted. "We'll do this in a proper room. Off the record doesn't mean off the hook." The executive stiffened slightly, but nodded. "This way, please." They were led through a quiet wing of the terminal, past glass conference rooms and shuttered lounges until they reached a private suite. Inside, water had been poured. A folder lay neatly centered on the table. Amanda's personnel file, incident statements, internal policies flagged in yellow. But Carter didn't reach for it. Eleanor took a seat and looked around. "Does anyone else speak for her?" she asked. The legal representative blinked. For Amanda? Eleanor nodded. Yes, she made a decision, but she didn't do it in a vacuum. Who told her that passengers like me were easier to ignore? Who trained her to look the other way when dignity called for attention? The room fell still. Even Carter said nothing. He realized, in that moment, this wasn't just his mother's story. It was her reckoning too. Her voice, quiet all her life, now cut through the air with clarity that demanded respect. We can fire her, the executive said cautiously. We can issue training protocols, make a statement. No, Eleanor said. You will rebuild your standards, and not for press, not for the headlines, for the people who sit quietly in your planes every day, wondering if they'll be seen. Carter leaned forward. We'll draft a framework, he said. Third-party audits, independent complaint reviews, mandatory retraining, and we won't ask. We'll require it, or I'll pull every ounce of tech infrastructure my firm built for you. The executive's jaw tightened. Understood. Eleanor stood first? Good. Then you'll walk us out. Not for show, for accountability. And so, they walked through the terminal, mother and son. No press, no entourage, no applause. But every step echoed with the weight of change, a reckoning that had begun with silence and would now speak louder than any announcement overhead. Justice, they knew, didn't always roar. Sometimes it walked off a plane with its head held high. The house was silent, not in an empty way, but in the kind of hush that follows a storm. A silence earned. Outside, the garden basked in the amber glow of late afternoon sun. The air soft, scented faintly with rosemary and fresh earth. Inside, Eleanor sat in a cream-colored armchair, her hands folded gently over a cup of tea. Her posture was composed, but her eyes lingered on the horizon as if trying to catch the last whisper of something unspoken. Carter stood at the window, phone silent for the first time in hours. He had declined press requests, paused board meetings, and told his legal team to wait. Not because the matter was over, but because he knew something deeper needed space to settle. Something that couldn't be wrapped in headlines or legal memoranda. The world would talk. But for now, it was his mother's voice he wanted to hear most. She hadn't said much on the ride home. She hadn't needed to. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was reflection, contemplation, a gentle gathering of her spirit. He'd watched her all afternoon as she moved through the house like someone reacquainting herself with stillness, with safety. Now, seated across from her, Carter finally broke the quiet. Did you ever imagine something like this would happen? He asked. Eleanor looked up, her eyes calm. Not like that, but I've imagined worse. She gave a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I just never thought I'd be the one holding the cup when it finally spilled. Carter nodded, his jaw tightening. It shouldn't have been you. Not after everything. Not again. No, she agreed. But maybe it had to be someone like me for the world to stop and actually look. There was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity. It struck Carter that his mother wasn't just resilient. She was resolute. She hadn't asked for justice. She had lived long enough to know it rarely knocked politely. What she asked for now was recognition. Accountability. Not just for Amanda, but for every time a quiet insult had been handed to someone who had no voice to return it. He moved closer, sitting across from her. The airlines made their moves, he said. Internal policies are being overhauled. They're implementing third-party bias training across all departments. And they've issued a formal apology to you on paper and in person. Eleanor stirred her tea, then looked up. That's a start. Carter studied her. But apologies are easy. Change takes courage. She leaned back slightly. And I'm not interested in whether they're sorry. I'm interested in whether they'll remember. For a long moment, neither spoke. The garden outside swayed with a gentle breeze, the shadows of the day growing long across the polished floor. Finally, Carter said, Amanda submitted a written statement. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, waiting. She said she didn't recognize you, that she was stressed, that it wasn't personal. Carter hesitated, but she also said something else. She said for the first time, she saw herself the way others might see her, and it made her ashamed. Eleanor's expression didn't change. Good. Shame's not a bad place to start, but it can't be the destination. He nodded, feeling her words settle deep. Do you want me to push for her termination? She paused, the question hanging gently in the air. Then she spoke, slow and deliberate. I want her to face what she did. I want her to feel it, not out of cruelty, but because without discomfort, there's no growth. But what I want more than her job gone is her understanding deepened. Carter leaned back in his chair, the weight in his chest a mix of relief and admiration. His mother, who had been humiliated and dismissed, still spoke of growth. Not vengeance, not punishment, just growth. I used to think strength was about staying quiet, Eleanor said, her voice softer now. About enduring things without complaint. But today taught me something else. That sometimes grace is loud. Sometimes it looks like a sun standing up in a cabin full of silence. Carter looked at her, his voice low. You gave me the strength. I just gave it back. Outside, a bird called out across the trees, and the wind carried its song through the open window. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, not from fatigue, but from peace. When she opened them, she looked at her son, not with sorrow, but with pride. It mattered, she said. It did, he replied. And in the stillness between them, a quiet truth lingered. Dignity, once reclaimed, never fades. It just waits for the right voice to speak it into the world again. In a single flight, a quiet elderly woman named Eleanor was reduced to invisibility by a careless act of prejudice. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand an apology, didn't retaliate. But sitting just behind her was someone who could, and did. Her son, Carter Brooks, a tech mogul with global influence, watched his mother be humiliated not for who she was, but for how she looked. That moment cracked the facade of comfort that had protected such behavior for too long. What unfolded next was not just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Carter didn't lash out with anger. He acted with purpose. He didn't want revenge. He wanted reflection. And through that, a powerful message emerged. Respect is not something to be reserved for the powerful. It is the right of every human being, regardless of age, race, or appearance. From the silence of a single act came a ripple that forced a billion-dollar corporation to examine itself, change its policies, and face the very culture it had allowed to flourish unchecked. But the story wasn't just about corporate accountability. It was about grace. Eleanor never asked for public vindication. She simply wanted to be seen. And Carter, by standing up, made sure the world did more than see her. They remembered her. He taught us that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in a seat by the window, enduring, until someone chooses to speak for it. The lesson here isn't just about calling out injustice. It's about noticing it in the first place. It's about looking closer, listening harder, and understanding that every silent moment we let pass is a missed chance to stand on the side of dignity. In our workplaces, on our streets, and even in the air thousands of feet above the ground, we are always given opportunities to either stay silent or to shift the story. If this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about the world we're creating, please support our channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling powerful, meaningful stories, because some truths deserve to be told again and again.